Mornings can be hectic. We get it. You're pressed for time, but you still want to stay informed. Let the connector from Boise State Public Radio do the work for you. Every weekday morning, this quick and convenient podcast delivers the top Idaho news stories you need to know, all in the time it takes to brew your coffee or start your commute. No scrolling, no searching, just hit play and get connected. Listen to the Connector Idaho Daily News wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. More Idaho Matters right now. Edward Fishman, a former top sanctions official at the U.S. State Department and author of the book Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare, has some mixed feelings about the current Trump administration's economic tactics, and he is joining us now to talk more. Edward, really nice to have you on the program.
Gemma, thanks for having me on today.
So the first thing I want to talk about today is tariffs. This has been news of the day, not just in the United States, but really globally. And the one thing I want to start with is that on one hand, you've actually praised Trump's stance on China, especially when it comes through the use of tariffs. So why does this approach work, in your opinion, in regards to China specifically?
Look, I think for many decades, honestly, throughout part of the 90s into the 2000s and the 2010s, China was waging a form of economic warfare against the United States, and we really didn't do much to respond. A generation of American leaders saw bringing China into the global economic order, into institutions like the WTO, as patently within American interests. And I think for a time it was. But even going back to the early part of the 21st century, it was clear that Chinese state-backed businesses were stealing intellectual property from American firms, were undercutting market share of American companies around the world, and at the same time putting significant trade barriers onto the United States. I mean, a classic example is some of the biggest companies in the United States, like Google and Facebook, don't even have any access to the Chinese market. So clearly there's a non-reciprocal economic relationship. So I think that some amount of course correction was necessary, and Trump during his first term did that. Biden during his presidency continued it, and we're seeing Trump continue it now. I think what is different so far in this new Trump administration is that Trump is out of the gate with much steeper tariffs on China, going to a 20% across the board tariff in under 2 months. And I think another really important factor is China is retaliating much more aggressively this time around than it did last time.
Well, and we have a company here in Idaho, Micron, who is extremely impacted by these tariffs with China. So how do these companies like Micron and like Microsoft, as you mentioned, move forward with these steeper tariffs?
I'm glad you brought up Micron. I mean, Micron actually plays quite a prominent role in my book, Chokepoints, because they were intimately involved in some of the creation of the original Trump export controls on China. The Chinese government stood up a memory chip maker called Fujin Jinhua that in 2018, the United States imposed export controls on and was a really significant move in the tech war with China. I think companies like Micron, Gemma, are in a very difficult spot because on the one hand, they do worry about having their intellectual property stolen by Chinese companies, by having Chinese subsidies outcompete them in the global market. But on the other hand, they rely on the Chinese market for demand, right? I mean, they're selling a lot of their product to China. So it's a double-edged sword, and I don't envy the role of people like executives at Micron.
So let's now talk about the economic warfare working best when you say it's bold and it's consistent, rather than what we've been seeing in this second term with Trump, which is, I'm going to sanction you, I'm going to put a tariff on, well, then I'm going to pull it back, then I'm going to put it back on. And it just seems to be creating chaos. So can you explain what you mean by this bold and consistent strategy? And does that go back to kind of what you said about China?
Yeah, so I think so far we have not seen a consistent strategy out of the new Trump administration. And I think that's one thing where we may be entering the worst of all possible worlds, because on the one hand, Trump is threatening these big tariffs on not just China, but also Canada and Mexico, which, significantly broadens the scope of the economic war beyond just adversaries to our allies. But then on the other hand, he kind of keeps waffling, right? I mean, there are now twice where he's been ready to impose really steep tariffs on Canada and Mexico. and then retracts, really right when they're about to go into effect. And what that has led to, Gemma, is actually significant hoarding by U.S. companies, U.S. businesses, even consumers buying as much as they possibly can to try to, front run the tariffs. And so what that's actually doing is it's perversely widening our trade deficit because Trump really can't seem to make up his mind. What I'm hopeful for is that as Trump kind of gets his legs under him, as more of his top cabinet officials get confirmed, as some of those internal battles that always happen under Trump's watch kind of get settled, that you will see a more consistent strategy. But I think the current course we're on right now is quite challenging for the U.S. economy, and I think it does risk something like a tit for tat, rapidly escalating global economic war.
Can you talk about the risk of imposing tariffs on our allies? Let's start with that. And one example I want to talk about is really alcohol, right? We've seen these tariffs placed on the United States now in retaliation, like on American whiskey. And then Trump says the other day, well, then I'm going to put 200% tariffs on wine coming out of Europe, France in particular. And now we have critics saying you will literally cripple the wine industry in the United States if Trump does something like that. So explain this to us again about really the ramifications of imposing tariffs on our allies.
Yeah, I do not think it makes any sense to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico. I think just from, zooming out, the idea that there's a national security threat on our northern border with Canada, it just doesn't pass the smell test. It's not true. So I don't think even the premise for the tariffs using the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is this law that really is only supposed to be invoked when there's a critical national security emergency, I don't think it applies to Canada. So I'm hopeful that over time, courts will find that these tariffs on Canada, at the very least, are not lawful. But beyond that, I mean, what we're doing is we're damaging the American economy. I mean, these are our two biggest trading partners, Canada and Mexico. Many of our supply chains are so deeply integrated, thanks to, by the way, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, the USMCA, that Trump signed during his first term, such that if you were actually to have a consistently applied 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, it wouldn't just be bad for American consumers having to pay more. It'd be bad for our companies that are buying components from Canada and Mexico. And I think that's why you've seen sectors like the auto industry come out uniformly against these tariffs, both on sort of the management side and the labor side. So I think the ramifications are quite dire if you were to go ahead with these 25% tariffs. I mean, so far, Trump, again, has backtracked, twice. But I think the only way that you're going to actually get the predictability that you need for the market rebound that I'm sure Trump wants is to be very clear that these tariffs are not happening, right? Not to sort of have this on again, off again every month thing that has sort of played out during the first month or two of the Trump administration.
And then at the same time as he is threatening tariffs on our allies, we also see him lifting sanctions on our adversaries. How does this play into all of it?
Yeah, so to be clear, he has not yet lifted sanctions on Russia.
Right.
So that is, it's an important distinction. I think the fact that he's open to lifting sanctions on Russia is concerning because, we have not yet seen Putin make any steps in the direction of a just peace in Ukraine. And in fact, what Putin seems to be trying to do is basically to pull a fast one on Trump, to try to persuade Trump that American companies have all these big business opportunities in Russia. To me, this is again a bit laughable. I mean, the one sector that Russia really wants sanctions relief on is oil and gas, right? They want more Russian oil and gas on global markets. But what would that do to the American shale industry? What would that do to the Gulf Coast natural gas producers who've been selling their liquefied natural gas to Europe because Russian natural gas has come off the European market? I think were Trump to actually fall for this trick that Putin's trying to pull on him, it would crush the American oil and gas industry. So I'm very hopeful that some of the advisors around Trump are letting him know about the dire potential economic consequences of giving this free gift to Putin. And that's not to say anything of the national security consequences of basically signaling that Putin can gobble Ukraine's territory without facing really any consistent long-term economic damage.
How does this approach have the potential to not just damage the United States prosperity, but potentially creating instability abroad as well. And 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 why is this important for the average American to really understand this issue? Because I frankly think that it is very difficult to keep up with everything that is happening, right? Things are moving at a rapid pace. It is exhausting to try to discern this information, to try to keep up with it. But again, the average American needs to understand these issues.
Gemma, I'm so glad you asked this question. The reason I wrote my book, Chokepoints, really goes back to my own experience in the US government in the 2010s, where it was very clear to me even then that we were living in an age of economic warfare in which sanctions, tariffs, and export controls have become the primary way that big countries compete with each other. But even then, knowledge of these issues in the public was very low. And you didn't see anything like the level of national discourse on economic warfare that you needed to have productive policies. I think the risk we face today, as we do move closer to something like a global economic war, is that you could see a chaotic breakdown of the global economy in which every nation is for itself. There's no long-term economic relationship that the United States really can have. And so US companies are really just forced to entirely look inward. I think for the average American, that's problematic because you'll have things like higher inflation, you'll have scarcity, like we saw in the early days of the COVID pandemic where we couldn't even access products that we need, and we'll have slower economic growth. But more to the point on global instability that you said, one of the key lessons of history is that when states can't access key resources through open trade, they're tempted into imperial conquest. And this is why imperialism, war, they're more the rule than the exception in history. And I worry that if we move to this global economy where every nation is for itself, the risk of war, a war that sends our sons and daughters to fight in foreign lands, I mean, it becomes frighteningly high. And so I do think this is something that Americans can't afford to ignore. And I'm hopeful that in reading Chokepoints, which I really did write to be accessible to anyone who really, follows the news, anyone who enjoys reading nonfiction, I'm hopeful that that can at least elevate our discourse publicly here in the United States.
Edward, I want to switch now to Ukraine. It was a meeting that went viral around the world. And what I'm talking about is when President Zelensky met with President Trump and Vice President Vance at the White House about 2 weeks ago. Can we begin this conversation with you explaining why this meeting was so critical?
So I think Volodymyr Zelensky has sized up the Trump administration well. He has realized that Trump may not care what the outcome of the war in Ukraine is, but he does care about American business interests. And to a certain extent, he also cares about protecting America from China. And what then Volodymyr Zelensky tried to do was basically to couch American support for Ukraine, not necessarily in terms of things like the inviolability of borders, which many of us care about, but I don't know if Trump does, but instead in terms of America's economic interests. And this is the idea of a critical minerals pact between the US and Ukraine that would then insulate the United States from dependence on China, which is currently the global leader in critical minerals. So I think the reason Zelensky came to Washington was really just to sign that deal with Trump and to start repairing a relationship that was going off the rails. What happened in the Oval Office, I think, is a tragedy because we were on the brink of getting that deal, which would have been good for the United States and good for Ukraine. And I think what Zelensky heard was Trump and J.D. Vance really spinning a narrative about Ukraine and Ukraine's shared culpability in the war that's just not accurate. And, people forget, despite what Trump says about Zelensky being a dictator, he is a democratically elected politician. And this is a public conversation that is also being broadcast in Ukraine. And it's not viable for someone like that to just sit and listen as this sort of alternative history is being told right in front of him. So I think Zelensky then pushed back on it, and J.D. Vance really saw an opportunity to kind of brandish his own credentials as a MAGA fighter. And that's sort of when the whole meeting really goes off the rails. So it was obviously a catastrophe. In my whole career working on diplomacy, I've never seen anything like that. What I will say, though, is thankfully it doesn't seem necessarily like all has been lost, because I do think that this deal ultimately would be in the interest of both Ukraine and the United States. And it seems like it still has a chance to get through, but that's really going to take President Trump, his leadership to kind of make sure that that deal happens.
So, where do you think the relationship now stands, in particular with Trump and Zelensky? And what does this mean for the future of Ukraine?
So I do think that Trump and many of his close advisors, like Marco Rubio, like Mike Waltz, the national security advisor, understand the stakes in Ukraine. And they do see that there's significant American interests in being more closely tied economically to Ukraine and not to allow Russia just to steamroll over Ukraine's territory. So thankfully, there are some of those voices in Washington, even though you may not hear them, loudly on cable news every night. At the same time, there are countervailing voices, voices like that of J.D. Vance, who even when he was a senator, voted against providing American support to Ukraine. And so I think, as with many things in the Trump administration, it's going to be up to these two factions to kind of duke it out. What I will say is Zelensky is a quite clever politician. He's very successfully worked with American leaders in the past. The Europeans stand solidly behind him. So I still have a little bit of optimism that the U.S. will continue backing Ukraine. But you never know. I think all bets are off, and things could continue to go south depending on how things play out in the next week or two.
What do you think is the most critical piece of information you believe all Americans need to understand right now in regard to geopolitics and our current standing in the world?
Yeah, I think the most important thing to understand is that the age of globalization is over. The 1990s, which is formative years for many of us, we used to think of economic relations between countries as win-win. For at least a decade or two now, it's very clear that between the United States and China, the United States and Russia, we clearly do not have a win-win economic relationship. In many ways, it's zero sum, not in every sector necessarily, but in many it is. And so I believe we are living in an age of economic warfare. I think we've been living in it. It's just accelerating right now under the current Trump administration. And I think this is the world we're going to be living in for at least the next decade. So I think what is imperative for Americans today is to try to learn about what's going on and to position both their companies and their families for this future, because it will be different from the 90s, the 2000s, what we're used to here in the United States.
Before I let you go, there is a lot of hand wringing, I would say, on both sides of the aisle, right? There are people who did not vote for Trump, who do not support this administration, who believe that our democracy is falling and we are in a constitutional crisis. There are other people on the other side, of course, who are praising all of this, but at the same time, there are now people who have supported Trump and his administration who are also concerned. With all that said, do you see the possibility of the United States being able to move through this and getting on the other side of it? Because, as I said, I think there is a lot of concern and at the same time trying to navigate this so that we do get to the other side of this. And can Trump be successful in this second term?
So I don't think it pays to underestimate the challenges that we face. This age of economic warfare is much more challenging to navigate, both as a government or as a business, than the age of globalization was. I mean, it's just significantly more challenging on every side of things. America's adversaries have been getting stronger as well. The China that we confront today has something like 75% of the economic power that we have. That's the closest that any peer competitor of the United States has been in at least 100 years. So we have very significant challenges at the same time, as you say, that our domestic political system seems to be sort of being torn at the seams. So we have very significant challenges. I think Trump himself has a very difficult set of circumstances that he's confronting, the same way that Joe Biden did. And I don't think that if Trump runs the country in a divisive manner, and it's particularly if he wages war on his own government, which, after all, we need good, smart government to tackle many of these challenges. I'm not confident that we're going to be in a better place at the end of this. That said, thankfully, as of this recording, America still is a democracy, and all of us do have a voice. And so I do think it's imperative for us to follow what's going on, make our own opinions on tariffs, on sanctions, on America's relationship with Russia and China and Europe, and to make those opinions known, because ultimately all we have to do is, we have that power at the ballot box, and we have that power to make our voices known in public opinion, and hope that government takes that into account.
I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so very much. We've been speaking with Edward Fishman. He is a former top sanctions official at the U.S. State Department. He is also author of the book Chokepoints, American Power in the Age of Economic Warfare. That book is available now. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.